This morning we ran a piece on the Daily Sceptic about the resignation of Dr Anthony Fauci, who is the expert's expert. We summarised a piece in the Wall Street Journal, by the Wall Street Journal editorial board, which was quite robust. Fauci, when he announced his resignation, was festooned, garlanded with every kind of tribute from Joe Biden on down. Joe Biden, I think, said he had touched the lives of every American, and that's true, but not in a good way. I mean, no. if you just look at, Fauci's record, I mean, I think he initially said 15 days to stop the spread when he announced the first lockdown. Well, that lasted up to 2 years in some states. He was an advocate for the lockdown policy, and we now know, I think, that the lockdowns have caused more harm than good. If you compare those states that had full, endless lockdowns like New Jersey, New York, with states like Florida, the ones with the harder lockdowns generally fared worse. He was a great advocate of the vaccines. He said when the vaccines were first released that they would actually stop infection in its tracks. And even though he had, I think, 2 vaccines and 2 boosters, he became infected fairly regularly, thereby disproving his prediction about the effectiveness of the vaccines. He was a great advocate of mask mandates. We now know that masks did almost nothing, in fact, precisely nothing to stop the spread
But at this point, people all over Twitter are shouting, "Are you a virologist?" Because their whole, even after 2 years of experts wrecking everything they touched, this deference to, well, it's not even authority, it's just deference to credentials.
Yes, and I think Fauci encouraged that, but it wasn't just, non-experts who dissented from the various raft of non-pharmaceutical interventions he recommended that he demonised. He also encouraged people to demonise other experts. So when the Great Barrington Declaration was published, and various quite senior scientists, including some virologists, signed this declaration and said, actually, there might be a better way, a less draconian way.
They're just from rinky-dink community colleges like Harvard and Oxford. You can't take them seriously, can you?
There was a very sinister email exchange between Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins, who is the director of the National Institutes of Health, an appointee of Fauci's, in which they talked about how they were going to discredit these dissenting scientists, which is hardly the right way to go about, debating an important public policy and the wisdom of lockdowns. But perhaps his greatest sin was he, at the very beginning, poured scorn on anyone suggesting that COVID-19 might have leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And then we later learned that the National Institutes of Health, which he ran, still does run, had given a grant to the EcoHealth Alliance, which had then part-funded gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And that suggests that he had an ulterior motive for debunking that particular hypothesis.
Yeah, and if you'd been run into that situation in any little district courthouse anywhere across America, a guy would have had to recuse himself for conflict of interest there. He's the guy coming up with COVID policy, and he's the guy who indirectly was funding it in Wuhan. Why do you think someone like Boris Johnson, who sees himself as the Churchill de nos jours, why didn't he take Churchill's attitude to experts?
Well, I think he may have been a little bit sceptical at the very beginning. And then he caught COVID, got quite a bad bout of it, and I think he felt a little bit incapacitated as a result of that. I think he was surrounded by people in his inner cabinet like Michael Gove, who were Matt Hancock, who were lobbying hard because they were listening to the experts, lobbying hard for lockdown. And I think, to give Boris some credit, he did at least lift the lockdown in this country ahead of most other countries. So when he lifted all restrictions on, July 19th last year, Freedom Day, at least he was ahead of some other countries.
Well,
so
for England.
Course-corrected for England, that's true.
Not for Scotland, Northern Ireland or Wales. I mean, one of the weirdest aspects of this was when we discovered that there was a hard frontier between England and Wales. English motorists were stopped by Welsh police I didn't even think of it as a border in that sense. I mean, it's almost as if the elected government and the legislature were entirely irrelevant by that point.
It is extraordinary. I mean, Fauci was effectively in power, unelected, for 38 years. And when it came to dictating public health policy during the pandemic, he was far more powerful than either president he served under during the pandemic. And, you know, the lasting impact of Fauci, I think, is that he's undermined public trust, not just in experts, but in science. That's why we see outbreaks of things like polio for the first time in decades in America, because he hasn't come clean about the shortcomings of the COVID vaccines, because he's over-egged everything, because he won't actually engage in debate about the wisdom of these various measures. I think he's undermined people's confidence in things like vaccines, and that's a terrible legacy.
Well, that's another question, though, is why did Trump go along with it? If you remember the early part of the pandemic, Trump was doing 2-hour press conferences live every night with Fauci and Deborah Birx and these other public health panjandrums alongside him. He could have handled it perfect, and it might actually have worked out better for him if he'd just been taking questions on his own.
Yeah, I think it must have been, in Boris's case, in Trump's case, a political calculation. They thought, well, people are going to die as a result of this pandemic. If I'm not seen to be doing everything I can to try and limit infection, those deaths will be hung around my neck like an albatross by these very experts that are advising me to lock down. If I ignore their advice, they'll leap to the press, they'll hang me out to dry. I think it was fear, political calculation, short-termism.